Welcome to the Conscious Combat Club, trauma-informed martial arts by women, for women. I'm your host Georgia, and I cannot wait to go on this journey with you. Please note that some listeners might find this content distressing. Take care, connect with your support networks, and refer to the organisations in the show notes below. Welcome back to our new segment, Fight Science. Fight Science is an episode format in which we will be having authors of peer-reviewed papers about martial arts and combat sports explain their paper in lay terms that you will be able to understand. And you'll get so much more out of listening to these episodes than you could even from reading beyond the abstract and getting into the paper itself, although we've dropped that into the show notes below if you want to check out this specific paper. These episodes are our attempt to contribute towards bridging the gap between research and practice. And today we welcome back Alex Channon. Dr. Alex Channon is a researcher and the course leader at Brighton University for the Bachelor of Sport Management and the Bachelor of Sport Studies. And Alex's research has covered a broad variety of topics related to martial arts and combat sports, including gender, sexuality, the media, violence, consent, which we have already covered on this show. Go back and check out the first edition of Fight Science to learn more about that. And today we are going to be talking about myths. Specifically, the paper is titled Boxing, Myths and Reality, Building in Sport Development Programs.
All right, so Alex, can you please explain this paper as if it's to a 14-year-old? And I'm going to start you off a 14-year-old who doesn't do a martial art.
Okay, yes. So this paper is about how different boxing clubs, different coaches might use their sport as a way to sort of help young people to grapple with not just becoming better at sports, but to solve other problems in their lives. So we're talking about things like, 14-year-olds will very much be aware of all this because they'll be getting it at school. Things like, saying no to drugs or, how to avoid violent situations. There are other examples where coaches are using sports in general, but boxing in particular as well, for things like sexual health education. So they're using sport as a way to sort of get young people interested in learning something positive and getting a positive message across to the communities they work in. Not only with young people, but usually these things are targeting children, teenagers, and young adults. So it's all about using boxing in this case to do some kind of social good work. That's kind of the main focus of these projects. And what our paper is about, because there's a lot of research about this field generally, but what our paper is focusing on is the beliefs that coaches and other people that work on delivering these programs, the beliefs that they hold about boxing and about its power to help to change people's lives and to do all these good works. And we're actually taking a fairly critical look at those beliefs, in that we're asking, what kind of evidence do people use to support those beliefs? And quite often the evidence they use is not particularly scientific. It's not particularly strong evidence. And we say, that can be a bit of a problem, because a lot of the time we assume that something really good will happen when we create a boxing program, get young people in, do boxing with them, and suddenly they'll never take drugs, and they'll never be violent, and they'll be really positive, because we believe that sport has this magical almost ability to do these things. It helps to transform people's lives and so on. Because we have that belief, it sometimes gets in the way of doing more careful research on exactly how boxing might help people. And is it just boxing that we need to do, or is it boxing in a specific way? Is it boxing plus social work? Is it boxing plus other things to help people to have these kind of positive outcomes? So that's what the paper is looking at, is the beliefs that people bring into these programs and how they sometimes maybe are a little bit too optimistic.
And are those myths directly related? So is the myth something that people think that boxing makes kids stop taking drugs, or is it more indirect, like boxing makes kids have more respect and discipline, and that makes them say no to drugs?
Yes, I mean, the say no to drugs thing is just one example of
Yeah.
many things that we might apply this to. But certainly, as you say, yes, there is this very sort of widespread belief, I think, in martial arts, combat sports circles, that doing these activities will teach you discipline. It will make you respectful. It will sort of make you a better person generally. I've encountered some, I say some, quite a lot of people actually in the martial arts world who are themselves quite skeptical about this, particularly instructors and coaches who've worked with children for a long period of time, whose parents expect them to be completely transformed by taking 2 lessons of karate a week, and like, why isn't my kid perfect suddenly? Come on, it's more than just this. So there is some sort of skepticism about this, but generally I think people that practice these things, they tend to have quite a positive view of them, and they tend to believe, that if we do, in this case, boxing, it is a sport that imparts discipline, and because that happens, therefore other things must also be able to happen. And I think it's really important to stress right from the start of this chat that in this paper we're not saying this doesn't happen. We're not saying it's complete rubbish. When we use the word myth, that doesn't mean it's a lie. These things do happen, they can happen, but what we're talking about here is that the positive outcomes become a myth, they become mythologized, they become part of this sort of uncritical belief system that exists in the sport. So we don't ask exactly how boxing might teach someone discipline, under what conditions might it make someone more respectful, what specifically needs to happen in terms of the gym culture, the coaching methods, the extent of competitiveness, the amount of education the coach has about safeguarding, and all of these other factors. We don't consider those because, well, it's boxing, and boxing by itself is sufficient to achieve, all these wonderful outcomes. So it's mythologizing of that possibility that becomes a problem, because it stops us from thinking about, the more intricate ways in which these sports can have a positive effect.
Do you think that there could be some positive from really believing the myth, in that they become self-fulfilling prophecies? So that if the coach really believes, maybe blindly, that by going through this program it's going to develop respect and discipline, then that is a more positive thing than having a more open mind, because they believe it, then it will become true, because they'll look for evidence and that will shift their focus. Is that something that's possible to tease out, or what do you think about that?
So I think if you believe that boxing creates an environment where people can learn respect and discipline, let's just stick with those 2 things.
Yeah.
For all of the things that we could do, and you believe that, and you work towards that, and you operate your club on those values, and you tell people that, and you constantly stress it and put it in front of them, then it's not just boxing, is it? It's boxing with an environment that emphasizes the importance of discipline and respect, which is not blind faith. Then it becomes a practical implementation of that belief. So you're absolutely right. That believing it and chasing it and aiming for that in our coaching practice, perhaps that's better than simply not, or being just really skeptical and having no particular ambition to do anything but boxing. But it's when people believe that it's happening by the way, we don't have to do anything towards those ends. That's when we would be quite critical of this, that the research literature that we have on boxing, on its own, suggests we do have some positive outcomes for young people, in terms of social psychological variables, lower levels of aggression, increased levels of sociality, and so on. But we also have research that shows increased levels of aggression, or actually increased criminal recidivism, right? So going back to crime. So it's not, boxing is not a silver bullet on its own. It has to be done in a way that accomplishes these goals. So if you were a coach who wholeheartedly believed this and put it into your practice purposefully, that's great. If you're a coach that might just sort of make that sort of as a throwaway aside, oh yeah, boxing teaches discipline, of course it does, but then you don't actually try to encourage that. You don't try to address any problems with club members not respecting each other and so on. Then that's, for us, that's where it's problematic. It's just faith, it's not action.
Yes, really, really interesting. Would you add anything to that explanation? I would say it's already pretty high level, but if we started talking about explaining it to a 14-year-old, if you were explaining it to an adult who has experience in martial arts, would you add anything to that summary?
I would really emphasize that practice element of it. But yeah, I think I probably went above the 14-year-old level a little bit there, but sure. We're talking to people who practice martial arts, who've got a bit of experience in this, especially people that have been at different gyms. Think about the culture in different gyms that you might have trained at. It might be that they're very similar. If you've moved around a little bit and you've done different martial arts, perhaps different combat sports, even the same sport but in different settings, you probably would have seen a difference. Just from personal experience, the gym I currently train at, quite a different cultural atmosphere to when I trained at when I was at university, for instance. And I think, very, very, much sort of respectful and a strong sense of equality as well in terms of gender. And that's a different topic, but we can circle back to perhaps. But the cultural atmosphere that exists in different gyms, and that all comes from, the coaching ethos. It comes from perhaps the makeup of the membership, but it comes from what the coaches get you to do, what kind of banter they'll tolerate, and where the lines get drawn with when people push things a little bit. So this is all about actual practice. So what do coaches and senior members of clubs do in these spaces to try and bring about these kinds of outcomes? And in the context of this paper, just to come back to the research, we're not talking about just regular boxing training. We're talking about purposefully using boxing to work towards these goals. If we're just doing that in a way that is, we've got some money, we've got a space, we've got a coach, here you go, do a 10-week boxing program. And all that gets done is just, intro to boxing, fundamentals, footwork, maybe a little bit of, tech sparring at the end. If that's all that happens, we're going to have very different outcomes to, okay, we've got this space, we've got boxing coaches, but we've also got people who are social workers who are part of the team. And, we're doing the boxing sessions, we're doing all that fun stuff. All the positive mental and physical aspects of exercise, but also we've got counsellors who are here to talk to these young people who might need specific support, or they might need general support. We've created a welcoming space that they can hang out in after school. They don't just come here to box, they come here to just hang out. So it becomes this haven. So two very different types of practice, if you see what I mean. And that's where I would say this conversation moves. It's not just about the ideas. That's important, but those ideas lead us to behave in different ways. And that's where I think the sort of the crux of the issue lies. What do we actually do in practice?
Yeah. What did you do in order to understand this topic better? I suppose I'm essentially asking, what were the methods in lay terms?
Yeah, so the methods for any piece of academic research, you'd always start with reading what's out there, reading the literature, the academic literature. So for this, this was a research team. It wasn't just myself. It was myself, Christopher Matthews, and then Ashley and Tom as well, the research assistants who work with this. So a lot of research in terms of looking at what do we know about sport for development generally in a broad theoretical sense. Looking at as well, this is the kind of stuff that I'm more familiar with, the sort of combat sports culture, doing a very broad sort of survey of what the existing research tells us about what happens in boxing programs. So you start with that. That gives you a sense of what we do know. It also gives you a sense of what we don't know, and that helps you to generate your research question. And then from there, you think, well, what's the best way to answer this question? So the thing that we wanted to find out specifically in this piece of research was, what kind of evidence do coaches gather to support or to show their programs are working or aren't? How are they evaluated effectively? And on the basis of that evidence, what do they believe about their work? So this paper focused on the belief side of things. The larger project was we'll probably publish some more stuff off that later on about the evidence practices and so on. But so we gathered data by doing a large survey, and then by doing interviews with a few people whose responses were particularly pertinent. So I can't take too much credit for this. I didn't do the data gathering on this paper. I just put that as a disclaimer. Yes. I was part of the research team, but it was the guys at Nottingham Trent that did the data gathering on this one.
Yeah, of course. And I'm super interested for the new stuff to come out, because I was wondering as you were talking, like we had some sneak peeks. Because one of the themes through the paper that I noticed was this idea around, it might not be possible to collect sort of like more empirical or highest quality data, and also it might not be desirable because that's not necessarily what the funders are wanting. They kind of want like the case studies or like the stories, which are great in of themselves, but are maybe not exactly the exact same thing as collecting good quality research. So what might that look like if somebody was running one of these programs and they did a really good job at collecting research?
Yeah, I mean that's the $1 million question really in sport for development as a field. The field is very much the academic field of sport development studies effectively it grapples with this for a long time, and then the kind of thing that we're advocating, a lot of our colleagues are actually saying, we've been trying this for too long and it's just not working. This kind of before and after, how does this variable change across time? There are lots of problems with that because you build those kind of studies around assumptions that researchers bring to these programs that boxing will have an impact on this variable or that variable. Can we be certain that we're actually measuring how disciplined a person is? I mean, how do you do that, right?
Yeah.
Is there a thing that you can put under a microscope? It's something that you have to rely on, questionnaires and sort of trying to quantify something that's very subjective and very difficult to measure. So it's very difficult actually to get scientifically robust data on the kinds of things that we're looking at here. Some of the ways that we might do this, if we're thinking about school-based research, and this is something I examined a PhD study recently that was looking at judo in schools, used to tackle antisocial behavior in schools, a judo-based program, and some of the data that was available was around school exclusion rates. So, and other sort of, formal disciplinary procedures in schools, and they could show in a fairly clear objective sense that there was fewer of these things happening after the intervention. So that doesn't necessarily show you that the children have become less violent or more disciplined, but it does show you something has changed in terms of the outcomes. So we can get at this kind of objective data, but it's always only telling us a bit of the picture. So it's quite frustrating as a scientist and as a researcher to want to get this kind of want to prove it, right? Does boxing make you more disciplined? Does martial arts improve people's lives? It's very difficult to prove that in a quantified positivist empirical sense. What we can do is, with the kind of qualitative methodology that we've used in this study as well, we can show what people think about the transformations, which there's tons of research that does this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this probably in a later episode on some of my stuff on gender, which adopts that kind of method to look at the impact of martial arts training on women. So we can do that. We can capture people's stories, their narratives, and we can show that it's had an impact on individual people. From that, we can say, well, it can have these kinds of impacts, when these kind of conditions are being met. So we're always kind of skirting around. We're not able to pinpoint and say really precisely with definitive confidence that doing this sport in this way will always lead to this outcome. So that's why with this paper, we're kind of throwing a bit of a cat amongst the pigeons for people who are the sort of true believers that oh yeah, boxing will save lives. I mean, it might have saved your life, it might help in some respects, but we can never be 100% sure. And what's currently going on in terms of what's being measured, which I think circles back to the question you actually asked, is very, very far from anything that I've just described. It is really just, let's just have one or two anecdotal case studies that are not done in an academic way. It's just a couple of testimonials from kids who have been helped by the program. That's enough to make the funders happy. They can put that on their little press releases. Look at this thing we're funding, aren't we? Great. Here's some more money to keep doing it. And it's kind of a virtuous cycle in that respect. But it all depends on sort of less than perfect evidence. That's a very long rambling answer. Hopefully I've addressed what you wanted to there.
No, I like it. I think, and it speaks to a lot of elements about this paper that I think are really important for people to understand. And what keeps coming into my head is a question that I do often get asked, which is, which is the best martial art for trauma survivors to practice, which is kind of, like the broad version of, which is the best martial art to practice for your mental health, or, in terms of sport development programs, well, which is the best martial art then in order to achieve that? And the answer really often is, well, it depends who's teaching it. Because two different kickboxing coaches, one might be, very, you could say, trauma informed, or one might have a very different coaching style than another one. And then also individual differences, where I think boxing, for example, really speaks to some people. And then for other people, they're a bit turned off by boxing, or for a million other reasons, they prefer a grappling sport like judo, which feels more non-violent, or a million reasons why people pick different sports. So from a sport development program perspective, how do you pick which martial art it even should be? And I don't know if we'll ever have an answer to that. What do you think?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think we can kind of get a bit more, or a bit closer to an answer with this one, in that you've got to ask who your audience is. So there's a group that I've been doing a little bit of work with. Me and my colleagues done a little bit of work with, called Fight for Peace, which you might have heard of them. They've been running for quite a while. They've got a base in London. They started in Rio. I think they do some work, I think, in Jamaica as well. They're fairly well established, and they've been running in London for I think a good 10 years now. And for them, boxing is the main thing in I think it's East London. We're dealing with kids who are sort of culturally, in terms of the local, the national and the local context, boxing is a sport that they can relate to quite easily. It fits with, boxing's cool, it's fun, it's something that they have role models that do box, and that kind of thing. So if you were to roll into town and exact same space, exact same kids, exact same expertise, and this program, by the way, just as a little side note, is very good. They do a lot of the social work stuff that I mentioned before. They're really very, very good at that, and they have a very strong orientation towards evidence-based and everything. So they're doing a good job, so to speak. If that same practice was happening and it was Aikido, for instance, it's not going to have the same draw for the kids that they're working with, because it doesn't have the same sort of cultural capital, to use that term. It doesn't resonate with how people see themselves. It doesn't carry the same kind of status. So boxing works because that's what the target audience wants. In a different setting, so in the Netherlands, for instance, kickboxing is a huge sport. You'll know about Dutch kickboxers and how they've got this fantastic reputation. So kickboxing would be a good choice. And actually, speaking to the coaches out that program at Fight for Peace, all the kids now, they want to do MMA. They're all asking about, can we have MMA classes? Can we do jiu-jitsu and everything? So because of this cultural sort of movement, they're tapping into that. So it doesn't really matter what the sport is, because the sport isn't the point. The point is to give something positive to a community and to use young people's enthusiasm for sport as a vehicle for addressing these kind of their needs, and hopefully helping them in various ways. But thinking about what will get them through the door, what's going to get them enthusiastic, that's a really important start, and that goes for all sport for development programs.
Does it matter that they are combat sports? Is that important, that there is a possibility that what you're learning has applications in self-defense?
I think it does, and that's a question that it can be quite loaded depending on who's asking it. And I know that as a martial artist and coach and practitioner yourself, you wouldn't be asking it with respect to thinking that it might lead to more violence, but there are other people that would ask that question with that in mind. Should we be teaching kids how to hurt each other? If our end goal is to try and improve their lives and make them more respectful and so on. Again, it comes back to how you do it, and you made this point quite well. It depends what the coach actually teaches. Are they teaching you techniques of fighting and just leaving it at that, or are they also teaching you some kind of ethical philosophy around this, which they might not say it's an ethical philosophy, but generally speaking, boxing coaches do a fairly good job at this. This is for the ring. This is the limits of what we do, and this is why we do it, and all that. So it's not just how to fight, it's also kind of why, and contextualizing violence that way. So this is something else that I've spent a bit of time working on with Christopher, my co-author on this paper, is thinking about how we can use combat sports as a vehicle specifically for teaching anti-violence, particularly for teaching about consent and mutual respect, because the nature of the activity involves something that comes quite close to violence, punching and kicking each other and throwing each other and so on. We have to think about that question. We have to have a way to understand, because we don't do this intending to hurt each other. We don't do this out of violent intentions or hostile intentions. We do this actually in a way that's very supportive. And we, if I'm going to box, I need someone to box with me. We're collaborating when we box. So we know all this by doing it. And we can use that knowledge that there's a difference between the punching in the boxing ring and punching on the street. We can use that implicit knowledge that we get in these settings as a vehicle to help young people reflect on, well, what is violence anyway, right? I want you to punch me in the boxing ring, right? This is mutually supportive. We're collaborating. We're helping each other. I don't want you to punch me outside, right? That's a violation. So let's think about what violations are. What other kind of violations are there? How do we know that someone isn't being violated? Well, we consent. Okay, so what does consent feel like? So actually, the fact that these activities involve physical combat can be a really fantastic resource for doing this kind of work. This isn't something we address in this paper. It's something that I've written about elsewhere. But the possibility for using combat-based activities to teach positive values, I think, gives us some really unique opportunities, which I think if coaches are sensitive to that, and again, it comes back to their practice, if they actually put those into practice and use them to those opportunities, to meet those opportunities, then there's some good possibility there.
Yeah, it makes me think of another theme that I pulled from the paper, which was that a lot of the interviewees were actually doing an element of that kind of like circle time or discussion around the work that they were doing. So even though the myth that was maybe being perpetuated was that it was the boxing that was causing these changes, they actually were already, like taking some period of time within a session to talk about broader themes related to some of those outcomes that were being achieved. And of course, because the research hasn't been done to be able to extrapolate what exactly it is, you can't say it's just the boxing, but then the idea that was being put forward was it's because they're doing boxing. But how do we know it's not because they're also having these conversations alongside that?
Totally. And that's, again, this is the idea that sport is a kind of a hook that brings young people in. So what do you do with them when they're in? And if some of the interviewees were, at pains to tell us about this, that we aren't just boxing coaches, we aren't just boxing practitioners. And it's kind of unsurprising that those are the ones that agreed to interview, the ones that want to tell us about all the extra good that they do. Which is kind of it's always a methodological bias in this field when you rely on the kind of the goodwill of people taking part in research. You generally tend to get people who've got something that they want to share with you that they think is positive, and in this case, reasonably good. Anyway, slightly distracted on that one, but yes, the use of the boxing environment to bring kids in, and then while you've got them in that space to do positive, constructive youth work with them, it doesn't feel like a classroom. It doesn't feel like you're being, hauled in front of the head teacher to be lectured about, whatever it is that the issue is. You're in a space that you love, probably, if they keep coming, you're in a space that you feel safe. For a lot of young people as well who really find themselves in sport, it might be that in the school environment they maybe feel like a bit of an outsider. They don't quite fit in there. In sport it's different. So when those opportunities are used properly, we would suggest you're more likely to see positive outcomes. But yes, doesn't really stop people from still believing that it's just the sport that does it magically. If you just lace up the gloves, you will become a better person. No, it's all the stuff that goes around that's where the magic happens.
Yeah. Okay, so if I'm a coach, I'm listening to this. So far, I've essentially taken in it might be handy to take some time to reflect on what I believe about whichever combat sport it is that I teach. Is that founded in evidence? Is that founded in myth? And just to be a little bit thoughtful. I think that's the point of this paper, really, is a critique to be like, well, what are we assuming as being real, and can we actually do that? Two questions. One, is this idea kind of transposable to the rest of the world, since it's a UK-based study? If I'm in Australia or if I'm in Brazil, are these ideas kind of universal, do you think? And then to follow on from that, is there any practical takeaway that you would give to coaches or any piece of homework related to this paper?
Yeah, so in terms of the generalizability question, I can't say with sort of academic, confidence, because we haven't done the research, but as someone who sort of existed in this field for a while, I think, yes, I think you see the same sort of practice, the same sort of stories, some examples of really, really good practice, really reflective and evidence-based, and, constantly evolving and adjusting to new conditions and so on. You see these kind of programs. You also see the sort of, it will happen by magic programs as well. So I think that the ideas are broadly sort of general to sport. I think it's fair to say. The exact narratives, of course, aren't, but the general thrust of the analysis, I'd be reasonably confident that this would fit with other contexts. In terms of the sort of the practical takeaways, this is a paper that offers more criticism than it does sort of solid advice, which is part of the project. Sometimes that's the way it goes. I think take seriously the need to evaluate what you're doing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to get a bunch of scientists in and do whole before and after research projects and all of that sort of malarkey. It's very resource intensive and not something that's easily managed. But don't just sort of rest on your laurels and think that whatever happened and whatever worked for you will work for everyone. And this is a critique that goes beyond boxing to all of sports, really. We tend to have this phenomenon that we call survivor bias. So if you start in a sport as a child, you enjoy it, you carry on, you're good at it, you have fun, you make friends in that sport, maybe you take it as a career, you're very much a survivor, so to speak, of that system. That system has worked very well for you. Then you get to a point where you're coaching and you're developing, or you're a PE teacher or whatever it is that you're doing, and you're imparting that same system back to young people. There's something inherently quite conservative about that, where we're not necessarily being open to new ideas, we're not adjusting to new circumstances. If we learn our craft, we learn a sport in one part of our country and we move to a very different part, is that context going to work? We're talking about different generations, of young kids. Is the same thing that worked for you necessarily going to work now here? So I think be reflective about your own experiences and the limitations of what that's shown you. And don't just focus on the positive stories of those kids that, like you, enjoy it and make it and come good. Think about what happens to those that don't stick around. What can you do to enhance the experience for those kids that come for a couple of sessions and they just sort of drift away? You've lost them, and that they might benefit from the potential that boxing or other combat sports has to improve people's lives. They might be the next case study that you use to the funder to get your funding, if you can adjust your program and make it suitable for them. So I think it's kind of a case of being open-minded and not just sort of living in this mythologized world where boxing is fine as is, and we don't need to think about or work on reaching these kind of other goals.
Thank you for being part of the club. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch, please refer to the information in the show notes. If you'd like to support this podcast, please consider leaving us a review or subscribing on whichever platforms you use to listen or watch the podcast. The Conscious Combat Club acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands in which we work, live, and play. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. We'd like to say thank you to Nari for the beautiful song Shape Me, heard at the beginning and end of every episode. If you'd like to connect with Nari, you can find her on Instagram at NariTheSaga.
Don't gotta tell you what my name is, I don't gotta explain it. Walk in the room, hear a boom erupting like I'm famous. I'm here shedding shells, I'm shameless. I fear nothing, no complacence. Walked too many tight ropes with no hope, so I became this poster they hold over all the heads of trauma holders. You don't need to know my history, I move boulders. Atlas shrugged, cause I lifted the weight up off his shoulders. No pretense of defense, move first like chess soldiers. This goes deeper than empowerment, cause I'm the one that power it. Physical meets mental, challenge me to keep devouring. If I can't change the scenery, at least I change perspectives. No longer isolated, but elevated and selective. Darkest places become beautiful spaces. This is where rage meets patience, meets power meets gracious. Meets, we're so glad you came, and the feeling is contagious. When you the walking impact of intended bad intentions. When you the manifesting of collecting all they tensions. You the soul and body, hold it all and still remember. But I'm a work in progress, testament to all contenders. Forgot what it was like to have control over self. Forgot what it was like to be the one in charge. Forgot in my reflection I could see all my wealth. Forgot that with my bare hands I break all these bars, barriers and obstacles. They can't cage me, they can't chronicle all my experiences and reduce them to appearances. When I was truly beaten, gave myself clearances to fall down, mess up, and get myself back up. I'm not looking for clovers cause I don't believe in luck. Damn, you were badass, I heard them say it clearly. Why thank you very much, I know now I'm not weary of what's next for me. Cause I expect to see growth like I was planted, watered, fed, and bloomed to be. The positivity and accountability, knowing they won't step if I'm the agent of my agency. I think I found my voice again, huh? I think I found my voice again, huh? I'm not sorry, you're the end where I begin. Boundaries, I know them well, take a breath and meditate. Who is she? I know her well, now I get to open gates. 1, 2, 1, 2, I don't need your permission. And if you get uncomfortable, then use your intuition to know that I won't stay where respect is ever missing. And everything I do, that's me making decisions. It's truly underrated, the value of self-worth. Forgot that I was rich from the moment of my birth. A penny for my thoughts, no really, you can't afford it. You cannot buy my story, rewrite it, or record it. You cannot buy my story, rewrite it, or record it, huh?